Well, hello. I'm Peter Asmus, Director of Strategic Marketing for AutoGrid, and we are on the grid edge. And today we have as our guest Tim Hade from Scale Microgrid Solutions. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
What's up, Peter? It's great to be here.
So, Tim, for those who might not know about your company, why don't you just give a brief overview? I know who you are, but just give us like a little snapshot of who Scale Microgrid Solutions is.
Yeah, sure. Scale's a company that I helped start 10 years ago. And what we're defined as is a vertically integrated microgrid platform.
Hmm.
Basically, what that means is that we work with our customers and do all the work necessary to provide them with microgrids. So we typically do that in the commercial and industrial space. But essentially, that means design, build, owning, and operating microgrids. And then in 2019, sort of the second business unit that we have stood up, which is an investment firm. And so we essentially run a distributed energy private equity focus firm out of Scale. Where we're investing in different technologies and different third party developers and things like that. So those are kind of the two pillars of Scale. We have turnkey microgrid services provider function, and then we have an investment function. And we've been building that and continue to do so.
Yeah, well, I remember, I think we first met around 2017 when the wildfires in California, I mean, there had been wildfires before that, but that's when really it was a major issue, including in Sonoma County, which is where I now live. And I know that, part of your focus was also kind of on more modular microgrids, this whole the saying used to be at a microgrid conference, you've seen one microgrid, you've seen one microgrid. And to a certain extent, there's a little bit of truth still there. But I think you guys were part of this thing, and now Schneider, obviously a partner of yours and AutoGrids, is also big on this whole idea of trying to streamline development, make it go quicker, etc. So why don't you talk a little bit about modularity, and also I think some of your early projects were like urban vertical indoor farms, really fascinating applications. So I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, but give us a little more background on some of that stuff.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we named the company after the problem we were trying to solve, right? And so if you think about the microgrid industry at a very, very high level, there are thousands of examples of really cool microgrids that generate a lot of value for end use host sites in existence in the world today. But the general problem for the microgrid industry is how do you go from megawatts to gigawatts, right? How do you think about deploying microgrids at scale, hence scale microgrid solutions? And so, about a decade ago, this is what we started thinking about was, how do you actually build a microgrid company that can do this in a much bigger way than traditional microgrid development has been done? And there's a lot of different components to that, right? I think on the technology side, really the key question is around modularization and standardization. How do you sort of, not make the engineering and design of these projects custom to every site, but how do you come up with
Right.
sort of a standard design and a standard equipment package that can be broadly applicable? But there's also things on the financing side and the contractual side and the development process side that you want to try to standardize as well. So you could try to do this in a much bigger way than it's traditionally been done in the distributed energy industry. And that's really what we focus on. And some of the other, leading developers in the space are focused on as well. And we're all trying to sort of crack that code. And I think, we're closer today than we were 10 years ago, but still not where we need to be.
Right. Now, quickly, then talk about this like idea of indoor vertical agriculture, which I mean, I hadn't even didn't even know this existed when I heard about. Wasn't it one of your first projects back east somewhere? Or
Yeah.
yeah.
So one of the first projects we did was with a company called Bowery Farming, still in existence today. And it is a vertical farm, right? So they grow leafy greens and are expanding into some other, produce types currently in a warehouse in Kearney, New Jersey. And so I think if you sort of step back and think about, why indoor agriculture, vertical farming was a target market for us in the early days, right? This has changed a little bit over the last decade, but if you go back to sort of 2014, 2015, and you were a microgrid developer, really what you were looking for was early adopter customers. And the key thing that you were looking for in an early adopter customer was who values resilience the most. Because that's
Right.
ultimately the killer app of microgrids, right? Is that, yes, it saves you money on a day-to-day basis. And yes, it helps improve your carbon footprint, reduces carbon emissions, things like that. But the biggest benefit of a microgrid is when the big grid goes down, you can continue to operate. And so you think about, different industries and different segments that appeals to. Indoor agriculture is very high on the list because if they lose power, they lose crops. And if they lose crops, they lose their business. And so having resilience for a company like Bowery was mission critical. And so that was sort of the, pretext that we walked in the door with. And we said, look, we can help you solve your resilience challenges in the most sustainable and economically viable way. And that was the starting point of the conversation. And, again, that's one of the first projects we built. So, again, we continue to like the vertical farming, indoor agriculture space a lot. They're going through some growing pains right now as an industry. I think there's like a fascinating debate about indoor agriculture and vertical farming that, maybe we can have on a different podcast, because I think some of the, mainstream media has been like a little harsh on that industry. And I think in some ways misses the point. But look, I think ultimately, if you think about like the macro case for vertical farming, the population is growing. We're going to have 1 billion more people in 2050 than we have now, and 85% of the arable land on the planet's already been used. And so,
Right.
how are we going to feed, the population of the future? We're going to have to get, creative about it, and that's why, we like working with indoor agriculture and vertical farming folks. And ultimately, we see that as a climate solution, just like microgrids are a climate solution.
Sure. Well, let's go back to, when we first met. You're talking about some of your early applications on the East Coast, but it was, we were in California. I remember I was working on a white paper at the time for Schneider Electric. I was with Guidehouse, and I remember you had some great testimony you had been working on. And I think, at that point, I was like, okay, this is the microgrid moment. The wildfires are happening. People need resilience, critical facilities. That was kind of the focus of my white papers, thinking about water districts, fire stations in these rural areas. And, modular microgrids seemed to be like the perfect solution. A lot of them were similar sized, but, we were pretty optimistic, but, and I mean, things happen, but I think we both thought things were going to happen quicker than they did. So I don't know if you want to reflect on that a little bit, but I think what we learned is there's still a lot of cultural barriers, regulatory barriers, etc. They're kind of being chipped away at. But you want to reflect on that, like what you were thinking at that moment in time? I know we were kind of like, this is it, it's happening.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in that respect, like we're very kindred spirits, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
think if you were around looking at this industry in sort of the 2017 2018 timeframe, um, as a reminder for folks, those were the worst wildfire years on record for the state of California. So during that time frame, you had the Camp Fire in Paradise, you had the Thomas Fire down south, you had the Montecito debris flow that killed 21 people that was a result of that. And ultimately, the source of a lot of those big fires was utility lines falling down and starting the blazes. And
right,
so, ultimately, if you have a good understanding of grid infrastructure and how it works, it became, I think, pretty apparent to people that the recipe for solving utility caused fires was going to be heavily reliant on public safety power shutoffs. And still today, right, that's the most effective tool that utilities have in their toolbox with respect to wildfire mitigation, is shutting the power off.
right,
And so then the question became, well, if the utilities are going to shut off the power all the time, it seems like there are going to be a lot of customers in the state that are going to want resilience. And look, I think, ultimately that trend is happening, right? That's what's happening in the state of California. That's why the state of California is the center of the distributed energy universe, and why some of the most innovative projects in the world are being built here. But it's also not happening nearly as fast as I thought it would, right? And I think there are a
right.
lot of reasons for that. A lot of entrenched interests. It's a complicated problem to solve. And, there are a lot of discussions happening at sort of the high level of government and the regulatory environment right now. But yeah, look, I think that's ultimately the challenge in California, and it's broadly reflective of the energy transition challenge that we're having nationally, which is we're doing the right things. We're just not doing the right things fast enough. And I
Right.
think that's going to be the real challenge for California over the next decade is, how do you go from, where we're at today to maybe 5 to 10x where we're at today from a distributed energy capacity standpoint in a decade? And how do you do so with, minimizing the cost of externalities? And so, look, I think all of us that were sort of looking at this in 2017, 2018 thought this was going to happen a lot faster than it has happened. But we weren't wrong about the trend, right? The trend is
Right.
happening. Distributed energy resources are proliferating. Microgrids are proliferating throughout the state. And it's just, again, not happening as fast as we need it to in order to really make sure that we have, the cleanest, cheapest, most reliable power available to ratepayers.
Right. Well, I think the other, you know, there are also a lot of positive things. So what's happened since that time, or even sooner, is the costs of the DERs, keeps going down. So the economics, it used to be people would say, oh yeah, you could have a microgrid, but it's going to cost so much more than, our backup power or the traditional solutions. And of course, the good news is those costs of solar batteries keep going down, and the controls keep getting better with things like artificial intelligence. And one thing that also I think has happened, and we want to touch upon this, is this idea of merging the concept of microgrids with virtual power plants, and the idea that microgrids, are not just totally self-centered, which is kind of what the view of some people used to have. Well, these microgrids, all they care about themselves. They have resiliency. Well, they can have resiliency, but they can also support the larger grid. But some of that's dependent on regulations. And of course, this DOE report came out recently, the liftoff report. And I know that you've said that now you're into virtual power plants too. So maybe talk a little bit about how scale, or you view this as this sort of this evolution of, how these terms, microgrids, VPPs, even DERMS, they're all kind of really, they're not like, there's not like hard lines between them. They're all kind of like a continuum, you could say, or I don't know how you describe it, but why don't you reflect on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
So look, I think the future of the distributed energy industry is virtual power plants, right? We could debate the nomenclature, but I think the Department of Energy has made it clear that we're going to be using virtual power plants as the nomenclature. But really, like what we're talking about is that we as a society organically are deploying distributed energy resources everywhere, right? That's true for, smart thermostats in your home and, refrigerators that are IoT enabled. And it's true for, solar panels on commercial rooftops and batteries in commercial parking lots, basically any energy resource that's behind the meter. And we're deploying hundreds of gigawatts of these over the next 20, 30 years anyway,
Right.
right? And so the idea of a virtual power plant is, since we're doing that anyway, how do we aggregate those distributed energy resources together and use that to aid in the energy transition that we need to accomplish? And so, ultimately, I think what, the DOE liftoff report is very explicit about is that if you are effective at aggregating distributed energy resources together and creating virtual power plants, that can actually reduce the cost of the energy transition from an electricity standpoint by maybe half, right? That's the importance of it, because ultimately, right, like one of the biggest drivers of cost from an electricity system standpoint is building out the transmission and distribution infrastructure that we need to electrify everything. And
Right.
so that concept of virtual power plants is really the key to executing the energy transition in a cost-effective way. And so that's like why it's so important from like a macro standpoint. Now, look, I think the good news about this is that I think those distributed energy resources are ready for prime time, right? So like one of the things people should know about this is nothing that we're talking about is like a nascent technology, right? whether
Right.
it's smart thermostats or solar panels or batteries or, electric panels or switch gear. This is all stuff that's been robustly tested over the past, decade or two.
Hmm.
Has millions of operating hours in the field. There's, hundreds of gigawatts of this stuff deployed across the country already. Um, and so, the technology is ready for prime time. I think really what you're seeing right now is the barriers more on the regulatory front than it is on anything else.
Yeah.
Right. And so the question is like, we have the technology to be able to do this in a really cost effective manner. What we lack is the regulatory precedent for doing so. And anyone who's involved in sort of the electricity industry and understands like the regulatory environment, it's complicated. It's very complicated. There are a lot of entrenched interests and there are a lot of different views on this kind of stuff. But ultimately, I think that's the value of the DOE liftoff report, right? The DOE liftoff report, that report was led by a young lady named Jen Downing, who comes at this from like a totally objective standpoint. She wasn't part of the energy industry. She worked at, I think, Bain. And then she came to work at the Department of Energy Loan Programs office. And her task was to kind of, with a blank sheet of paper, go out and look at what the value of virtual power plants is. So it comes from a very objective place. And again, the conclusion is basically we need to deploy 200 gigawatts of virtual power plants in the next 7 years in order to execute the energy transition the most cost-effective way for society as a whole. And look, I think that is something that everyone sort of needs to take to heart. Is when objective people look at this, the answer is build a lot of virtual power plants, and that feedback needs to go back into the cycle. And I think regulators and in a lot of cases, utilities, especially investor-owned utilities, need to embrace that and figure out a way to get it done. And so again, right, I think that's what all the data suggests is that we have to really, really ramp up the number of virtual power plants we're deploying. Whether or not we do that or not is really going to be determined, I think, more by how the regulatory construct evolves than anything else.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, the beauty of the virtual power plant and why it's more cost effective is these, if you just look at the assets already out there, you're just getting more value out of stuff that other people have paid for. Like a lot of times people use the example of, Uber or whatever, private assets, but the values and the scheduling and the delivery, electricity is more complicated, but that's it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this idea, I think what's really exciting, and companies like Green Structure, other parts of the Schneider network are merging this concept. And of course, now there is a new microgrid product that includes AutoGrid's basically VPP software doing more the economic optimization, the bill sort of, optimizing the bill to lower the cost of the bill. So there's kind of all these synergies, but you're right. I mean, usually technology does advance quicker than policy. And this case is no different, although, generally the trend is positive. There's been some issues about net metering reform and stuff, but also some of the old policies maybe don't work as well. As we get more and more DERs, also, even people supporting clean energy sometimes have to open up their minds a little bit, saying, well, actually, in this new environment where there's lots of solar. Before, I remember, because I've been around for a while, when the utilities just totally ignored behind the meter solar. It was so small, they didn't even pay attention to it. They didn't even account for it. Now you can't do that. So now I know that, speaking of, pushing up against barriers or pushing the envelope, I don't know how much you want to reveal, but I believe you are working on a project in California. That's all I'll say. I don't know how much you want to talk about,
Yeah.
but you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I guess, two things, right? I mean, first of all, back on your point on the regulatory environment. So look, I think that the way that this is evolving is kind of as to be expected, right? Which is,
Hmm.
I think you're generally right. If you look at any other industry as a proxy, like as a general rule of thumb, technology evolves faster than policy and regulation. I think the thing that we have to keep in mind when it comes to the energy transition is that unlike some other industries and some other products that are out there on the market, we're working on a clock, right? So, on one hand, right, I try to be patient right, with regulators and policymakers when it comes to, hey, this is a process, and there's a lot of stakeholders involved, and we're trying to find a balance and all that jazz, right? And so it's going to take us 5 years to write a regulation that we could write in 5 months. And then I read like the IPCC reports that come out, right? And it's like, if you guys don't take drastic action in the next 10 years, the planet's going to melt, is basically the conclusion. And that's when it's like very, very frustrating to wait for something for 5 years that should take for 5 months, right?
Right.
And so, ultimately, I think that's the challenge that a lot of people in the energy transition or the climate tech space face in general, which
Yes.
is, we're trying to move so fast, not because we want to, but because we need to. And that's what the climate scientists are telling us we need to do. And then at the same time, this bureaucracy that currently runs the energy system is preventing us from moving as fast as we're capable of moving. And so like trying to figure out like how to find that gray area between, pushing regulators and government officials to move faster, but not like pissing everyone off and making them hate you. That's like kind of
That
the
takes
hard
special
thing.
skills. It takes special
Yeah, it's
skills.
it's hard, right? And I mean, you know this from knowing me from a long time. Like I've skirted that line a lot over the last decade, and I'm still learning on the fly, right? In terms of like how to effectively navigate these things. But it's not happening fast enough, right? And I think that's like one of the things that we all need to be clear about up front, is that like regardless of what you think, it's clearly not happening fast enough, and we need to do better. So with that in mind, right, you alluded to this. Yeah, like what I'm working on right now is a virtual power plant in Santa Barbara, California. And there's a few reasons for that, but the biggest reason that I'm working in Santa Barbara, California is Santa Barbara, California has one of the least resilient electric grids in the country. So essentially, we have a county that has 400,000 people in it. One transmission line provides about 70% of the power to the county. And if something were to happen to that transmission line, portions of the county could be without power for weeks or months. And so that is an issue that is top of mind for a lot of folks that live here. And because of that, they are on the cutting edge of adopting distributed energy resources and microgrids and technology like that. And so ultimately, right, what we're trying to do is come in and say, okay, we're going to build a lot of microgrids and distributed energy resources in Santa Barbara County anyway, because everyone's concerned about this resilience thing. How do we do so in a way that helps facilitate the energy transition to a cleaner, more affordable, more just grid? And so, yeah, like, we're working with a big coalition of folks, right? That includes SCE, that includes the local community choice aggregators that serve Santa Barbara County, 3CE and SBC. That includes a lot of environmental groups that are based here, and a lot of local, political folks and local elected officials and things like that. And we sort of brought everyone in the community together, and we're trying to figure out how to build kind of the optimal virtual power plant that could be a model for cities and towns across the world. And that's what, I'm spending, I don't know, 80% of my time on right now. And I'm really excited about it, but still, very, very early stages and lots of hurdles to overcome. And as you know, right, with project development, most of the time it doesn't work out. And so, my sort of North Star right now is making sure it works out. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
Right. Well, I think you literally moved to Santa Barbara to make this happen. Isn't that the case that you
Yeah.
actually? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Look,
that. Yeah. Yeah. Go
look,
ahead.
I think it's an important point, and maybe this is like maybe this is like an educational moment for people who are listening to this, right? So look, I think at the end of the day, right, when COVID happened, like one of the only things I was optimistic about was I was hopeful that as a result of COVID, I would never have to leave my house again to do work, right? I was just like, okay, well, I could do all this on the computer, and like I can get deals done on the computer. I'm never going to have to go meet people in person. That'll save me travel time. It'll make my life more efficient, whatever the case might be. So in like a world of bad, that's one of the things I saw that was good. It turns out that like that's just not the way the world works. And so, like, if you actually look at, all these metrics that we measure as a business in our, CRM and all this kind of stuff, the number one indicator of success in developing a project is touch points, physical touch points with the customer. How many times do you meet them in person? And I wish that wasn't the case, but it is what it is. Like, the data, at least for us, is irrefutable when it comes to selling these types of, commercial and industrial microgrid products. So when I kind of had this idea to work in Santa Barbara, the first thing that became very clear to me is, like, if I'm going to do this, I need to be in Santa Barbara. I need to be part of the community. I need to be meeting with people in person on a regular basis and building those relationships and explaining why I'm trying to do things. And on top of everything else, right? Like, I think one of the things that people know about me as I'm developing this project and I'm talking about the benefits that will accrue to our community, from a resilience standpoint, from a sustainability standpoint, from a local air pollution standpoint, people know that my kids live in this community, right? And they know that, like, whatever I'm doing from a community standpoint is not just going to impact others, it's going to impact me and my family. And I think that gives me a level of credibility when I'm talking about this stuff that really matters. And so, look, I think, one of the things that I've kind of been thinking a lot about is, there's this old saying that, all politics is local,
Yeah.
right? And I think in some sense, right, that's true for development as well, right? Which is that, really this is about, when you're trying to build these types of virtual power plants that are kind of the wave of the future here, you really have to be embedded in the communities that you're talking to, and you need to understand, like, what matters to them, what matters to, that community, because it's a little bit different, right? Like, it's a little bit different when you're in Santa Barbara, California, or you're in Ridgewood, New Jersey, right? Those are different constituencies. And so, I think being part of the community really matters. And, it's something that I think a lot of developers have to just accept, right? Which is, if I'm going to build a project, I have to plan on being there on a pretty regular basis to have, like, sort of those in-person touch points. At least what we've seen is that's the thing that really, like, accelerates the probability of success.
Right. Well, at a much smaller level, as you know, I used to work for Guidehouse, and I would be doing these global market forecasts and, all this stuff, sort of, someone might say ivory tower, sort of the stereotype. So I actually tried to make a few very small microgrids happen where I lived, and I thought it was very educational just seeing, and these are like a small community center. And actually, they actually happened, but it also took forever because a lot of these, these are small, tiny things. I mean, this is exaggerate, but, volunteer boards. But we got some funding thanks to like the local CCA for a battery. A lot of it, it's just, hey, we got a solar system, we got a backup generator. The fire chief, I remember trying to talk to him. It was during a PSPS event. It was a beautiful day. There was no wind. And he goes, how come I can't use my solar? And I had to go, well, there's these rules, etc. So, no, I think it, getting in touch with the real world is helpful for us all. So, we're probably going to have to wrap up, but I think, what you talked about, and, here we're kind of approaching the holiday season. And, I was just reflecting lately about gratitude on, this kind of work. Cause I remember I started out, kind of stopping bad stuff. One of my first books was about Rancho Seco in Sacramento, the only nuclear power plant ever shut down by a citizen vote. And, I remember, it's much easier closing sort of like the bad guy. What's much harder is, well, what do you replace that with? And what's the solution? And I think one thing probably both you and I share is but that's what we need to focus on. We can't just stop bad stuff. And what's exciting about renewable energy is it's such a, it generates jobs, economic development, but it's good for the planet. And, how can you not be for renewable energy? Now, obviously, there's people concerned about certain aspects of it, but just, to wrap up here, I mean, I'm sure that you are, the work you do is very satisfying. You moved your whole family to Santa Barbara to try to make this happen. Just any final reflections here as we kind of ease into the end of the year, the holiday season?
No, look, I think, ending the year with gratitude is a really good idea, right? And I think, one of the things, at least I've been, talking to folks inside Scale about, right, is that, Look, I think when you're doing this stuff on a day to day basis, it can be exhausting and it can be really, really frustrating. But if you sort of step back, right, and you look at the forest through the trees, I mean, we're making a tremendous amount of progress, right? If you compare, really over the last 2 years, and I kind of look at, the passage of the IRA as like,
Right.
D-Day for the renewable energy industry. I mean, we've accomplished amazing things. And I think the important thing about the IRA is not just that we passed historic climate legislation, but basically everything that we said was going to happen if we passed the IRA is happening, right? We're bringing
Hmm.
manufacturing back to the United States. Hundreds of thousands of jobs have been created over the past 2.5 years by this industry. Lots of good things are happening. The deployment and the deployment curves of renewable energy generally are going way up. The deployment curves of distributed energy resources are going way up. And so it's happening, right? Like what we're doing does matter and it is working. But it's slow and frustrating, and you sort of get caught up in the day to day of this stuff. And so, yeah, I think that's a great way to end it, right? I'm very thankful to everyone in this industry who's been working so hard for so long. You've been a big part of that, Peter, and the work that you've done over the years and all the books that you've written and all that kind of stuff. And I think collectively as sort of a group, we're making a lot of progress and we're helping drive the world in a more positive direction than it would move on its own. And so really grateful to everyone in our industry, and really excited because this is just the beginning. So hopefully I'll be back next year with another positive update.
keep keep the optimism going, and yeah, and really, this the Santa Barbara project is fascinating. One thing we hinted at is this idea of microgrids and VPPs merging, which sounds like kind of that's the concept there. So Tim, have a great holiday with your family, holidays, I should say. And thanks so much for joining the podcast.
You're the best, Peter. Thanks for having me.
All right. So long.